It is now my pleasure to introduce the person who is going to introduce our guest speaker and also is representing the Chief of Naval Operations this evening. Mrs. Easter is a good friend of mine for several years now. She and I serve on a board, and it's been a real honor to get to know her, and I'm so proud of her, watching her career as I have with the Joint Program Office for the Joint Strike Fighter, and then she was with the Army for some strange reason why, but she came back to us and is now the DNS Director of the Navy Staff. I couldn't be prouder of her. She's a graduate of North Carolina State University, and for that I forgive her. But it wasn't like chemical engineering or something that I can't even spell. And anyway, we're so proud of you being here with us this evening and serving your country as Director of the Navy Staff. But I know probably the thing you treasure the most, of course, is your kids, and we just had a great conversation about the young doctor and also your son. So, ladies and gentlemen, Director of Navy Staff, Mrs. Stephanie Easter.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. Okay, great. I'm from North Carolina. I need feedback. So, I'd like to welcome everybody here as we celebrate the 77th anniversary of the Battle of Midway dinner. On behalf of CNO Richardson, I'd like to thank everybody for being out here and coming out and helping us celebrate this very special occasion. It's been an amazing day. I started the morning up at the Navy Memorial, listening to our beautiful Navy band, watching the CNO and others lay the wreath on the memorial, and listening to the history of the Battle of Midway and why this day is so important to us. What I remember most about this morning is the CNO talked about the importance of our carriers, our ships, even our submarines and our air wings in the prevailing in that conflict, the Battle of Midway. But what I remember most is how he talked about the people, the men and women who served with the toughness and the tenacity that has become so prevalent within our Navy today. So I just wanted to take one more moment and just recognize our veterans that are here today, our World War II veterans, because they embody that very spirit that the CNO talked about this morning, that toughness and that tenacity that remains the strength of our Navy today. And it's also exhibited in the young men and women that are escorting them, that wear the uniform as well today. So please join me in a round of applause for that. He also mentioned the importance of breaking code in Japanese and German code during this conflict. And as he was talking about that, I was actually thinking about our guest speaker for this evening. And it made me think about the great work that she has done to bring a remarkable story to us and a little piece of our history that I think is often overlooked. So it is my pleasure to introduce this evening our guest speaker. Ms. Liza Mundy is a journalist and author of 4 books. Code Girls is a riveting story of a brave American woman who cracked German and Japanese code to help win World War II. From my brief research and from the CNO's remarks this morning, I know that code breaking played a pivotal role in the Battle of Midway. So we are fortunate to hear your thoughts today, and we look forward to it. Liza has 3 other books and writes widely on various publications. She has appeared on numerous national television and radio shows. She has a degree from Princeton University, which is a Master's of Arts in English Literature from the University of Virginia. She is a local native. She lives in Arlington, just about a mile from Arlington Hall, where the Army Code Breaker women worked. If you take a moment and look at her bio, I think the last line in there kind of sums it up. She does a lot of things, and she does them all extremely well. She writes books, she takes care of her family, and I just have to take the liberty and say, you go, girl, okay? So please join me in a warm welcome for tonight's guest speaker, Miss Liza Mundy.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction. It's incredibly moving to be here today. I just have to turn on the clicker for the PowerPoint. I know there's nothing more exciting than a good PowerPoint presentation after a fine dinner and a few glasses of wine, but I promise you, it's not charts and graphs and slides. It's historical photos that I came upon researching my book, and I think that you'll enjoy them. I never get tired of looking at them, and I never get tired of sharing the story of the women. All right, we'll start there. Great. So, but first, I do want to underline how moving it is for me to be here tonight, and daunting too, because there's such a vast knowledge of World War II history and naval history here in the room, and it's hard to believe that there are untold stories from World War II, but the fact is that there are, and I know that everybody in this room, or many of the people in this room, know a great deal about the Battle of Midway and about World War II history, but I think that you may actually learn a few things as well. So I love to start my presentations with a slide that I think of as depicting the plight of the college-educated woman in 1942. So the women who you see on this platform were graduating seniors at Goucher College, which many of you may know is now a coeducational college in suburban Towson, Maryland. But back in 1942, it was what was called a girls' school, a women's college located in downtown Baltimore. And the women who had, Goucher, like many women's colleges, had been founded in the late 19th century at a time when many, many Americans thought that higher education was not only undesirable for women, but was actually bad for women and could hurt their health. There was a Harvard physician who argued that getting a college degree actually made women infertile because it swelled their brains at the expense of their wombs. So there was a fair amount of actual prejudice against letting women become too educated in the late 19th century and early 20th century. And so there were back in 1942, only about 4% of American women attained a four-year college degree. Now, college going wasn't common among men either at that point. Most people just got a high school education at best, but far fewer women achieved a college degree than men. And the reason for this, again, was because lots of people thought that it wasn't necessarily good to educate women. And many, many campuses, as we know, were closed to women. The Ivy League was largely closed to women. Many private colleges and universities in my home state of Virginia, UVA held out for as long as it could in awarding full four-year degrees to women. So women were shut out of a lot of real estate. And even if they got a college degree, they would be shut out of most professions back then. If you were the graduate of a women's college in 1942, pretty much the only job you could reliably expect to get was teaching school. And that's great if you want to be a school teacher. But if you want to be a lawyer or an architect or an engineer or a business person, you were likely going to be shut out of those graduate schools and those professional networks. So a lot of families didn't think it was worthwhile to pay the tuition for a young woman to go to college in 1942. So these Goucher women were really unusual. They were actually called Goucher girls at the time. And these would have been the cream of the crop. The young women selected for the May Court, which was one of the graduating ceremonies for the seniors. It was very common at women's colleges. And it also signifies that one of the reasons that a family might pay the tuition to send a daughter to college was so she could get her proverbial MRS degree, right? We've all heard of that. The thinking among families was that if you sent a girl to college, she could date men at nearby universities, hopefully make a marriage to a man with good prospects, and secure her economic and sort of social future that way. So and in the case of the Goucher girls, it will not come as a surprise that they dated a lot at Johns Hopkins and they dated a lot at the Naval Academy. I've interviewed some of the women on this platform, and they were in Annapolis basically all the time, staying in boarding houses that in some cases were chaperoned, and some cases actually not that chaperoned, they recalled. And ceremonies like this were existed to symbolize that these women were being ushered into the marriage market. And so the women that I've interviewed recall enormous pressure to do well academically. These were great liberal arts institutions. The women had to take Latin, Greek, math, physics, English. They got really thorough education. They were pressured to do well, to show that women could and should be educated, but they were also very pressured to get engaged by the time they graduated from college. And in fact, at schools like Wellesley College in Massachusetts, in the senior class yearbook, there was the list of the women who were engaged, the graduating seniors who were engaged, and the names of the men they were engaged to, as well as lists of women who had actually left before graduation in order to get married. So there were really powerful dual pressures on these women to perform well academically, but then to get married and start raising families right away. And that was really their foreordained future. And what I love about this photo is it shows how the world was changing even as these graduating seniors are there on the May Court platform. So this woman, Jackie Jenkins, later on after the war, her fiance actually was at Wake Island. He was a prisoner of war during all of World War II. But after the war, when she married Edwin Nye, she would become Jacqueline Jenkins Nye, mother of Bill Nye, the science guy. So that gives you a sense of her intellectual chops. And her good friend, Gwyneth Gaminder, those two young women had already been secretly tapped by the U.S. Navy to learn how to become naval code breakers. And this was top secret intelligence work that they had been singled out for learning. They had been chosen by their professors secretly who had ties to the Navy. In fact, Dean Stimson of Goucher, the woman who was the dean of Goucher, was the cousin to Secretary of War Henry Stimson, and he put in a quiet word asking her for her best graduating senior women. And so unbeknownst to anybody on that platform, unbeknownst to their families, their roommates, their brothers, their boyfriends, these young women and about a dozen other members of the graduating senior class were already learning how to become naval cryptanalysts. And the reason that those women had been singled out to do this top secret war work that would change their futures forever was, of course, because on December 7th, 1941, we had been attacked at Pearl Harbor. It was the catastrophic, cataclysmic event, as all of you know, that propelled us into World War II, which had been raging for a couple of years now in Europe. We declared war on Japan the next day. Germany declared war on us 3 days later. And all of a sudden, America is at what was called total war. That was how World War II was referred to. And it was, of course, a global war. And so, you know, within a matter of days, weeks, young men are shipping out on aircraft carriers in the Pacific. They're on convoys crossing the Atlantic Ocean. All of our young men are signing up to fight. Any man, you know, who qualifies is signing up to fight. At exactly the moment when we are appreciating just how unprepared we are to anticipate enemy attacks. I mean, I think it's fair to say that among the other things that Pearl Harbor was an intelligence failure. It was an attack where our Pacific Fleet was anchored. We hadn't seen it coming. There were no torpedo nets. There were no barrage balloons. It was a big surprise on a Sunday. And of course, heads would roll. But the military and all of Washington realized that as we are sending these young men into harm's way, we need to significantly ramp up our intelligence gathering capabilities. It's hard for us to remember because we live in Washington at a time when we have 17 intelligence agencies. We have intelligence agencies that exist to oversee other intelligence agencies. And back then, you know, we had very little in the way of intelligence gathering. Of course, there was military intelligence, there was naval intelligence, there was a small code-breaking bureau, but it wasn't going to be enough, you know, to anticipate attacks and to plan attacks for a global war like this. And so we'll start to build a spy network overseas. The OSS will be formed, which will later become the CIA. But building a spy network, as you know, takes a lot of time. And so what the military could do more quickly is significantly ramp up our code-breaking abilities and our code-breaking facilities. So the effort will be made, within a matter of weeks to really ramp up our code-breaking activities at exactly the moment when the young men who normally would be tapped to do this kind of intelligence work and brain work were suddenly unavailable, right? Because they're shipping out to fight. And so when I was doing my work in the National Archives, I actually came upon a naval memo in which the light bulb moment goes on over the head of a naval officer. These were monthly memos that were being generated by the Navy's small code-breaking bureau before the war, saying where they were getting their recruits, who they were recruiting from, and how they were training their cryptanalysts. And so you can see, this is actually, I think in December of 41, as they're trying to figure out where are we going to get our code breakers, someone writes, news source, women's colleges. So up until then, the Navy had recruited men from places like MIT and Harvard. They had math and astronomy professors who were constantly sort of looking at the undergraduate student body to tap select young men to try this work. All of a sudden, those men are unavailable. So they decide, since the educated young men we would normally turn to learn how to do this work are now unavailable to us, let's see what the educated young women can do who have achieved their college degrees despite these enormous barriers and discouragements. So this was really a light bulb tipping point kind of moment. And it was a sort of a simultaneously terrible and wonderful moment in which educated women are going to be competed for in a way that they have never been competed for in American history. And as a result of this light bulb moment, young women at Goucher, like Jackie Jenkins Nye, and women at the Seven Sisters colleges, Wellesley, Smith, Mount Holyoke, Radcliffe, those colleges in the Northeast, would be secretly tapped by their math and astronomy professors. They would be invited in one by one. They would be asked 2 questions. Do you like crossword puzzles, and are you engaged to be married? And if they answered yes to the first and no to the second, they would be invited to take this correspondence course that the Navy had developed, a top secret correspondence course to train their cryptanalysts. And so all of their senior year, in addition to their coursework, they would be secretly trained by a Navy officer and by a member of the faculty, meeting in locked classrooms, often in the dead of night, to learn this arcane, little-known tradition called code breaking that has really existed as long as human beings have been able to talk and write. We have had the urge at some point to communicate in a secret language, that someone else can understand, that hopefully nobody else can break. Every child has the urge to do this at some point in their life, and certainly, obviously, militaries, politicians, diplomats carry on coded communications. It didn't exist so much in the United States before World War II, but there was a long tradition of it in England. And so these women would be taught all sorts of Renaissance tables, ways that letters can be scrambled, and ushered into this arcane field. And they would come to Washington, this first group, in June of 1942, which, as everybody knows, is the month in which the Battle of Midway occurred. So the women were flooding into Washington, that class of 42, right after graduation. They got letters from admirals basically begging them to get to Washington as soon as they could, and they would begin pouring into naval headquarters downtown, sitting on upturned wastebaskets as the offices got so crowded, at exactly the moment when the Battle of Midway put code breaking on the map as something that was going to be very important to the outcome of World War II at a time when we did not know what the outcome of World War II was going to be. It was certainly not foreordained that we were going to win this war. And so, as everybody in the room knows, one of the turning points in the Battle of Midway was our ability to read the Japanese Naval Fleet Code, JN-25. The Japanese had set out to ambush us at Midway. They were going to finish off what they hadn't done at Pearl Harbor, finish off our Pacific Fleet. We, by then, were reading the JN-25 messages. There was debate, as you know, in the Pacific about what the geographic coordinates AF stood for. We knew that they were headed for a place called AF. There was disagreement over whether it was Midway or some other place. And so Joe Rochefort and other naval code breakers brilliantly sent this American message in the clear saying that they're low on water at Midway. The Japanese picked that up, sent their own messages, and they used the coordinate AF, and so we knew that AF stood for Midway. So it was a brilliant, brilliant code-breaking coup that many people are familiar with. What people don't necessarily know is that the reason that we were able to read JN-25 was because of the woman sitting over there to your right, to my left, Agnes Driscoll. And she had actually joined the U.S. Navy during World War II, during World War I. It's what was called a Yeoman F. They were also called yeomanettes. A lot of people don't know that before World War I, there was nothing in the code book saying that a yeoman had to be male. And so during World War II, when they were staffing up the Navy, and the Secretary of the Navy, who was married to a suffragist, who might have planted the idea in his head, he sort of wondered aloud, well, is there any reason why women couldn't join the Navy? And it turned out that there wasn't. So for a brief moment during World War I, women were recruited to join the Navy, and Agnes Driscoll had been a Texas school teacher. She was a math genius, and she was a musician. She joined as a yeomanette. Those women were kicked out after World War I, and the law was actually rewritten to close that loophole and to shut women out of naval service, but she rejoined the next day as a civilian, and she was on the code-breaking desk during all of the 1930s trying to diagnose how the Japanese naval fleet code worked. This was a time when code-breaking was not a prestigious occupation in the Navy. It was sort of a dusty desk job. You didn't want that job if you were a career naval officer. You wanted to be on a ship, right? You wanted to be out on the ocean, but a civilian like Agnes Driscoll then would be stuck at that desk, and so she spent the whole decade of the 1930s figuring out how the Japanese were enciphering their messages. They were using something ultimately called a super enciphered code system in which a word like destroyer would be rendered as a 5-digit code group, and then they would add another set of digits to that using something called non-carrying addition. And what Agnes Driscoll did was she was looking at those Finnish code groups that had the additive added to it, and all she could see were those numbers. And she spent that decade figuring out the system, and that is what code breaking is at the highest level. It's diagnosing how a system works, and then code breaking becomes breaking each individual message. And she had trained Joe Rochefort, she had trained Tommy Dyer, she had trained these officers who then went to the Pacific, and they credit her in their memoirs for training them, and also for generally breaking the system. We knew how the system worked even before Pearl Harbor, but the Japanese had changed their code books. So the system was dark before Pearl Harbor, but by the Battle of Midway, we had gotten back in to the system and we were able to read those messages. So she's one of the really storied code breakers. She should have a book. She should have a biography written about her, but there were no oral histories taken of her. She didn't have children, so there's actually very little in the way of letters or any kind of a record to fill out a biography, but she was a very, very important person who was really behind the Battle of Midway in ways that she's never gotten credit for. And of course, not to take anything away from the men in the Pacific who were fighting that incredible battle, but it is worth knowing that she played a very important part as well. It's also interesting to know that at the outset of World War II, the division of labor in the two oceans was that the British had lead code-breaking responsibility for the Atlantic Ocean. And if you've seen The Imitation Game, or if you're a student at all of World War II, you know that the Germans were using an Enigma machine to encipher their messages, to scramble the letters of their messages. And the British had broken that, thanks in part to Alan Turing, before we entered the war. And so we are now very invested in the Atlantic War. We're sending our young men in convoys across the ocean. Wolf packs of U-boats are waiting for them. But we sort of cede lead responsibility to the British, who broke that system, even as we are junior partners, and we are actively helping them with that effort to pinpoint where the wolf packs are so that the convoys can get through safely. But meanwhile, we have lead code-breaking responsibility for the Bath Pacific, where we have just been terribly surprised with Pearl Harbor. And the division of labor between the services is that the Navy has responsibility for the Japanese Naval Fleet Code, but the U.S. Army has responsibility for the completely different code and cipher system being used by the Japanese Army, which is now spread out around the Pacific, right? The Japanese have taken Guam, they've taken the Philippines, they've taken Wake Island, they've taken all of these land masses, and they're using a different system. And so the U.S. Army is having to gear up as well, and they also need women. So again, it's this terrible, wonderful moment when women are being competed for by military services as well as the private sector, and the Army's strategy to recruit women, now that the Navy has sort of sewn up all of these fancy women's colleges, is to recruit school teachers, because the other well-educated people who are underpaid and overworked and looking for jobs are these school teachers, these female school teachers, all of whom have good degrees from either from teachers' colleges or women's colleges. So I won't dwell on the Army's role, except to say that this is my central character. She'll be 99 in a couple of weeks. She was actually kindly invited to the dinner, but she's not. She did travel a lot after the book was published, but she's not so much traveling right now. Dot Braden was a school teacher in Chatham, Virginia in 1942. She was a graduate of a women's college in her hometown of Lynchburg, Virginia. She was the daughter of a single mother who was supporting 4 children. She had 2 younger brothers who had already entered the Army. They were in the Army, and she wanted to do her part as well. And the Army strategy for recruiting its women was to send its handsomest young Army officers to lurk in post offices and hotels to recruit civilian women. They would all start out as civilians. The thinking was, and I literally came across this in oral histories, the officers thought, well, if we can lure these women by these handsome men recruiting them, they'll come to Washington expecting to make a marriage to a good-looking man like that. So they thought that marriage would be the lure to get these young women to come to Washington. And what I love about Dot's story is she shows how wrong-headed the recruiting strategy was, even as it did work. She was looking to get out of a marriage. There was a lot of pressure on young men and women to get married before the men shipped out. So there was even more marriage pressure at the beginning of the war. She had a college boyfriend. She liked him fine, but she didn't want to spend the rest of her life with him. He was now in training camp in California. He had sent her a diamond ring in the mail. He wanted her to follow him to training camp in California, and she didn't want any part of it. She liked him. She wished him well. She felt like she had to wear the ring because women were told not to upset the morale of the troops. Women were made to feel responsible for the morale of the soldiers, so she didn't feel like she could send the ring back. So after her first year teaching high school in Chatham, Virginia, she went to the Virginia Hotel in Lynchburg. There was a handsome young officer behind the table. She didn't care what he looked like. She just knew that this was an opportunity to do secret war work in Washington. She knew it would pay twice as much as the $900 a year she was making teaching school. And she knew that it would be a way to try to bring her brothers home and to show that women also could serve their country during wartime, and that it was a way to get out of a marriage that she didn't want to enter into, and that it was also an opportunity to come to Washington, D.C. She had grown up in Lynchburg 3 hours from Washington and had never been to the nation's capital because all of these women and men grew up during the Depression, and her family didn't have a car, and there would have been no way, well, besides train, but they didn't take vacations, they didn't travel, they worked. And so it was her opportunity to come to Union Station. She found her way to what would be the Army's code-breaking facility. It had been a junior college for girls. They kicked the girls out. They needed a top-secret, off-the-beaten-path compound. They moved the code breakers in. They built temporary buildings. And I'm just going to go quickly through. These were civilian women, former school teachers, working for the Army's code-breaking operation. And I won't dwell on their duties, but this will give you a sense of how many young women came to Washington to do this work. And I will say that that Dot, as a school teacher, was part of a group of 200 women, most of them former school teachers, who participated in one of the 3 most important code-breaking successes of World War II. One was the breaking of the Enigma cipher. 2 was the breaking of the Japanese Naval Fleet Code and victory at the Battle of Midway. But 3 was the relentless sinking of the ships that were supplying the Japanese army on all of these islands. They were called Marus. They had been requisitioned from the private sector by the Japanese army. Everything was brought to the islands by ship, right? Rice, water, food, medicine, veterinary medicine, animals, reinforcement troops, spare airplane parts. It was all being brought by ship using the Japanese Army's super enciphered code system. And school teachers like Dot had to work as fast as they could. She remembers running to take the message to the next station. They were getting the messages broken that told where the ships were bound and what they were carrying. They would get the message broken as fast as they could so that the intelligence could be radioed to an American submarine commander who would be waiting on the horizon when the supply ship appeared. And our successes in that endeavor were such that most of the deaths of the Japanese Army were the result of starvation and disease because they weren't getting the food and the medicine that they needed. And when I try to tell Dot Braden how important her role in the war was, it's very hard for her to even get her mind around it. They knew it was important. They knew they were working around the clock as hard as they could, but she never knew that she was in part of one of the most important code-breaking operations of the war, which certainly shortened the Pacific War. And because we're also talking about D-Day in Normandy, I'll just talk briefly about this group. There was a group of Japanese diplomats, as you may know, who were stationed in Europe. And they were using, again, a completely different cipher system to communicate back to the Foreign Office in Tokyo. And that was a very important cipher system. They were sending very long, descriptive messages about what was going on in Europe. So ironically enough, the Japanese diplomatic code, generated by a machine that we called Purple, and the intelligence was called Magic, they were our best source of intelligence out of Europe because they were talking to Hitler, they were talking to Mussolini, and they were passing all of these wordy dispatches back to Tokyo. And we read every single one of those messages, thanks in part to another woman named Genevieve Grochin, who had been working for the Army's very small code-breaking bureau before the war. She had aspired to be a college math teacher. She could not find a university willing to hire a woman to teach math. So she was hired by the Army as a civilian, and they were desperately working in September 1940 to break this Purple machine. And she had the key insight looking at the patterns that allowed them to break that system and basically to build machines that could that could break that system. And among the nuggets of intelligence that we got from the Purple generated system, when the Japanese diplomats were invited to tour the coast of France to see Hitler's Atlantic Wall, to get a sense of the fortifications, they reported back to Tokyo on where it was well fortified and where it wasn't. So when we were planning the D-Day landings, we knew, thanks to that system, that Normandy would be a better place to invade than a slightly better fortified place like Calais. So again, that's the kind of intelligence we were getting from these code systems, and that Genevieve Grochin is one of the people we have really to thank for the fact that we were reading those message systems. Again, this will give you a sense of the number of women doing this work. There was a very important African-American code-breaking unit at the Army's facility. Again, former school teachers, women who had achieved their college degrees despite the barriers of being in a segregated American education system. Even more academic real estate was closed to these women than to the white women. And they were working the codes and ciphers of the private sector to make sure that companies and banks weren't doing business with Hitler or doing business with Japanese companies like Mitsubishi. So that was a very important unit as well. They were helping plan deception programs. As you may know, we actually created dummy military traffic to persuade the Germans that we were going to invade at Calais. And so there were Army women, WACs, who were studying our message traffic to create dummy traffic so the Germans would think we had the first U.S. Army group poised to invade Calais when in fact no such group existed. And so to get back to the Navy, you'll be glad to know that the Navy women were invited. The Army women were kept civilians. The Navy women were invited to join the U.S. Navy. This was a tipping point for women in the military, women in the Navy. You can see them crossing Nebraska Avenue in their elegant designer uniforms. We were just talking about sort of uniforms and controversy around uniforms. And in fact, when the women were invited to join the Navy might be a little strong term. I mean, there was certainly opposition to women joining the Navy, and there was opposition to women being allowed to wear navy blue. And some of the primary people battling for women's inclusion in the Navy were the deans and presidents of these women's colleges. And they realized it was very important for women to show their ability to be leaders. There was a lot of discussion about women's leaderships and opportunities, and they knew that it was very important that the women be allowed to wear navy blue. And so at first the Navy wanted the women to have to wear gray or khaki, and the women fought very hard for that beautiful navy blue. The women were not allowed to wear gold braid, though. They had to wear dusky blue braid, which was very beautiful, but wasn't the full gold braid. But they were not an auxiliary. They were full members of the U.S. Naval Reserve. The women who were college educated became officers. And it was also a wonderful moment when even a woman who hadn't been secretly tapped to join from her college class, women who didn't have the benefit of a college education, could enlist in the U.S. Navy, and if they tested high for aptitude and the sort of pattern recognition abilities and the sort of tenacity and persistence and resilience and grit that you need to get up every morning to break code systems, if they tested high, they would be routed into the U.S. Navy. So it was a wonderful moment for women to get on troop trains and to come from California and Oklahoma and Colorado and in the Deep South, and to leave their small towns and to become part of the U.S. Navy, which you can see the camaraderie that the women are experiencing working in the code-breaking facility, which is on Nebraska Avenue. It's where the Department of Homeland Security is now. That was the Navy's prime code-breaking facility during World War II. And just to share one of my favorite anecdotes about the women's experience in coming together as part of the Navy. One of the women I interviewed for the book, named Jane, she was a debutante from the Upper East Side of New York. She had grown up in a very wealthy family. Jane Case, her father, Theodore Case, was a physicist. He had actually done communications work for the Navy during World War I, and her parents didn't want her to join the Navy. There was a lot of sort of slander at first against women who were joining the military. It was thought that they were bad girls, that they were being put into the military basically to service the men. There were a lot of whisper campaigns against women at first. So it was kind of scandalous, but Jane was very patriotic. She badly wanted to serve. She wanted to be part of the U.S. Navy. So she took the subway for the first time from her fancy Upper East Side apartment down to Naval Recruiting Station. There was one in the Wall Street area, and she knew that there was going to be an eye chart. She was very, very nearsighted, and so she had memorized the eye chart. So she slipped her spectacles in her pocket. She made it through the eye exam, but then she had to go to all of the other medical examining stations at the recruiting station that she had not been aware existed, until she got to the place where she had to disrobe along with a lot of other women for what would be a naked group physical, which she had not anticipated either. And so what she remembers most vividly from this recruiting experience is that she had to take off her clothes, which she had never done before in front of other women, and I think it was a petty officer came up and drew the number 9 between her breasts and said, "All right, go stand between 8 and 10. And because she was so nearsighted, she not only had to sort of look at all the other women, but she had to really get close and peer in order to figure out where she was supposed to stand. So that was her welcome to the Navy, which she remembers very fondly now as sort of a hilarious story. But the other great surprise, in addition to the naked physical, was finding out that she had gone to a music college in Boston she hadn't gone to college, she had gone to music school after high school to take voice. And she thought that she would be made an officer because of basically her fancy family and the music school, but the Navy did not consider that the equivalent of a college degree, so she went in as an ordinary seaman, as an enlisted woman, and it remains the best experience of her life. I mean, she she was not at all sorry to leave the Upper East Side and debutante society and to work amidst these other just remarkable, wonderful women from all over the country. She remembers that her first bunkmate was from the Midwest. She was the daughter of a funeral home director or mortician who gave her a music box in the shape of a casket. And so Jane, remembers that was her introduction to decorating schemes that she had not encountered on the Upper East Side. But you can see the women in these rooms. These are stacked naval messages, Japanese naval messages. They had to make very quick decisions looking at this super enciphered numeric code system that the Japanese were using. They had to decide which were the most important messages that had to be hurried along as quickly as possible, again, often in order to get the intelligence out to a submarine commander in anticipation of Japanese actions or to locate Japanese ships. And she could tell we could tell what was happening in the Pacific because the stack would get larger. This is just a worksheet in which the women are trying to subtract out the additives in order to get down to the actual code groups and then tease out what the code group said. So it's all brain and pencil work that they're doing. And they were intimately tied to the Battle of the Pacific. They knew about the amphibious landings. They knew, I came across memos in which they would be told basically, something's going to happen in the Pacific in the next week or two. We need you to work faster. We need you to work smarter. We need more additives recovered this week than were recovered last week. And I would get the memos basically congratulating them for not only meeting their quotas, but exceeding their quotas. These women knew that their brothers, their boyfriends, their fiancés were out there in the Pacific. In some cases, they were able to track the passages of their brothers' ships and report back to their parents on the men's whereabouts without telling them how they knew, because this was top secret intelligence work. The women were all told that they would be shot if they talked about their work. That was their welcome to Washington. Generally, was to be sat down in the chapel that you can still see on Nebraska Avenue and told this is top secret intelligence work. To reveal it during wartime is an act of treason, and the penalty for treason is death. And don't think that just because you're women, you won't be subjected to the ultimate punishment. So they were very, very aware of that. So they would not tell anybody what they did, and they were tested. They were often tested on the streets of Washington by men, often who were naval officers, but who were sort of clandestinely testing them to see if they would reveal anything, and they didn't. By 1944, actually, by D-Day, it's important to note that the Americans had really taken over Atlantic code breaking from the British. The Germans had figured out that we had broken the Enigma cipher. They made the Enigma machine more complicated. There had been 3 rotors scrambling the letters of a German message. They added a 4th rotor, and the British machines could no longer handle, they didn't have the speed and the capacity to unscramble this more complicated system. So the Americans built these giant machines called bomb machines. They were secretly built at a factory in Dayton, Ohio. They were shipped in secret to Washington, and they were run by women, by American women. Often the Goucher women were working on this, the Wellesley women, and essentially what the women would do is they would look at a scrambled messages just of gibberish. And they would know maybe that this was a message that pertained to the weather in the Bay of Biscay, which is where a lot of German subs were located. So they would conjecture, well, Biscaya wetter is probably a phrase that'll be in this message at a certain point. And then they would look at the scrambled letters, and they would basically design early computer menus to figure out how the machine would have scrambled the letters in order to transform them into what they were seeing. They would feed it into that machine, which would tell them if they were right. They would feed it into a different machine that would transform the scrambling into German. And then women who had majored in German would translate those messages. They would take them upstairs where Bill Nye's mom and a bunch of other Goucher women were maintaining these massive wall maps showing all of the location of all of the U-boats. And in part, as a result of that effort, we cleared the Atlantic Ocean of the U-boats so that the massive convoys that were sent across the Atlantic to mount the D-Day invasion could do so safely. And these women also experienced D-Day from the unique vantage point of one of the women remembers coming to her watch, to her midnight watch, just as it was becoming June 6th. And they knew that D-Day was going to happen, but she didn't think it was going to happen that night because of the full moon. She thought that the full moon would be a deterrent. It wasn't. But she remembers that at about 1:30 in the morning, our time, the messages started chattering, the messages started coming in, and the women were reading basically the Germans, the messages that they were looking out at the English Channel from Normandy, and they were seeing, you know, thousands of Allied ships, realizing that the invasion was happening in Normandy. And so the women were reading the messages all that night and participating in the D-Day landing from their offices, and very, very much feeling part of this massive global effort to liberate France and to liberate Europe. And it was, as you can imagine, it was an unforgettable experience for the women. And very moving to read about their memories. The women they had very little free time, but during their free time in Washington, they were going to the beach, they were writing lots and lots of letters to men overseas. It was not uncommon to be writing a dozen men, right, to keep up morale. My central character, Dot Braden, was writing a half dozen men at the same time. She was actually more reluctant to have that go in the book than the fact of her code breaking. She was nervous about the world learning how many men she was writing letters to. And she would manage to disentangle herself from her fiance. She made best friends with a school teacher from Bourbon, Mississippi. They were friends for the rest of their lives. She married a tall airman, actually, and lived happily ever after with him. And her good friend, the school teacher from Mississippi, would become an analyst for the NSA, because the National Security Agency is our descendant agency of wartime code breaking. And those women remained such fast friends for the rest of their lives that their children thought they were related to each other when they were little. They thought they were cousins, because they knew that their mothers shared this powerful friendship, but they also didn't know where the friendship came from, because the women never talked about the work that they did. They were told after the war, thanks very much for your service, now go home, and never tell anybody what you did. And the story would be declassified in the 1990s, but nobody tracked the women down and told them that it was finally okay to talk. So most of them kept the story for the rest of their lives. Many of them took it to their graves. And so the children didn't know what the bond was between the two women, and the two women didn't know that they were both part of the Japanese supply ship code-breaking effort, because they never talked about their work even to each other. But their friendship remained that powerful. And this group of Navy women remained friends for the rest of their lives. And after the war, they went their separate ways, but they missed each other so much, and they missed their camaraderie, that they started a chain letter that was sort of, it's almost like an early version of Facebook, that a group of friends, you would write this letter about your life and what you're doing and send it to the next person. She would send both letters to the next person, and then it would go around the circle, and you would take out your old letter and you would put in a new letter. And that chain letter, that friendship letter system, kept going for 75 years. It kept going, through all the decades that followed, to the point where, when I was doing my reporting, two of the women were still writing each other almost every day. And the woman in the striped shirt, Ruth Mirsky, is the only member of this group who's still alive. And when she writes me emails, her email sign-on is Ruth the Wave. So even though she could not talk to anybody about what she did, she didn't get credit for it, she wouldn't even show me the commendation medal that she had gotten because they were told not to, her identity as a naval enlisted woman, as a member of the US Navy, was that important to her that for the rest of her life, that would be the way that she thought of herself, and the work was that important to her. So for me, it was an incredible experience to get to talk to these women and be entrusted with their story. I truly think of them as the hidden figures of the greatest generation. There were more than 10,000 of them doing this work in Washington. They comprised more than half of our code-breaking operation, which was larger than that of England. So it was a massive group of women who did not get credit until recently for the work that they did. I have a few videos. I won't take up your time with all of them, but I think I just want to show the last one, which gives you the sense of how seriously the women took their work and why they were so motivated to answer the call when they were tapped. So you're going to hear from Dorothy Romali, who was studying to be a math teacher when she was called in by the Army.
A bus came And it was at 2 o'clock in the morning that the Army sent a bus to get these, I don't know. It seemed to me it was all the men, that there were no men left there in the college at that time because they all had to go, I think, to Pittsburgh. You see, since I was taking mathematics, a lot of times I was one of maybe 2 girls that were in the classes, you see. So I knew so many of the fellows that were going on that bus. I'll never forget.
I don't know if you could tell, but she got tears in her eyes when she remembered the sight of the men in her math class and the men at the teachers' college being put on the bus and sent to the enlistment station. And so she was powerfully motivated, as were all the women, when she was called in by the dean of women at Indiana State Teachers College and asked to take the Army's secret code-breaking correspondence course. And what I love about Dorothy Romali, in addition to that memory, is that she became a math teacher after the war. That was her aspiration. It was a high aspiration for women because they often weren't hired as math teachers, but she became a math teacher at Swanson Middle School in Arlington, Virginia, which is the middle school that my own children would later attend. And I love the thought of these middle schoolers taking Miss Romali's Algebra 1 or Algebra 2 class, having no idea that this sweet, kind woman who many people remember, I've heard from so many people, they remember her as the best math teacher they had ever had. But of course, these school children would have no idea that she had been a badass code breaker during World War II. And in fact, you'll be happy to know, she was so good at her work, the Navy ultimately stole her from the Army. She was working on the Japanese supply ship effort, and the Navy dangled an officer's housing allowance. And she was able to live with her sister and save the $50 a month that she got for officers' housing, and she was able to use that to buy a car and actually made a trip cross country after World War II. So I love her story in particular because it just shows that these women continued to walk amongst us. In some cases, they continued to walk amongst us. And again, it was the great honor of my career to get to spend time with them and try to convey their story. I'm so grateful to them for their service. I'm so grateful to all of you for your service, and particularly to the World War II veterans who made the trip to be here. It's an honor to be in your presence. So thank you so much.